Don't catch lightning bugs. My son kept asking me why I was driving so fast as I blew through a third stop sign and jumped the curb. I was in a race against the sunset, and I was distracted by the contents of the jar I had my son cradle in his arms. I hadn't seen them in years, not since I moved to the subdivision and pushed the city to adopt a pest control strategy that, as an intentional side effect, a perk really, would drive them out and away. I kept asking my son where he found them. He eventually told me he found them down near Westside Park in the town over. I floored it through my sleepy suburb to that park next to the small forest preserve. My son persisted asking me what was wrong and why his jar of lightning bugs was so important. The fact was, I said nothing to him in reply. I had been avoiding the topic for years. I never told him not to catch them because I hoped he would never see them at this prime, foolish, boyish age. All the flack I took for pressing the town to adopt those pesticides and those plants and flowers over others to keep them away. I never told him his story. I didn't want to scare him. When I was his age, my parents left my brother Dylan and I home alone so they could attend a company summer party. Of course, we were too young to still be home alone, but Robbie Morgan, the human hybrid undercooked chicken McNugget couch potato, was our babysitter, and was the next best thing to being home alone. It was around 9 p.m. that Robbie had already crashed out on the sofa, hypnotized by the boxy TV of the time, reeking of port rinds and cheap weed. The house, the neighborhood, was as good as ours. I remember Dylan delivering their good news of Robbie's premature clockout just as the batteries in our toys died. We had a game of chase with Dylan's T-Rex toy that had a dangerous bite feature, in addition to being able to fake walk on shuffling feet with wheels on the bottom. The T-Rex would chase me with Dylan's guidance while I maneuvered my radio-controlled truck toy into its path in an attempt to trip it up before it could land a bite on me. We sneaked around the house, gathering our backpacks and flashlights to set out into the night before boredom could set in. We contemplated taking our young dog, Cody, a husky mutt, with us, but instead we simply refilled his water dish. Dylan brought a jar for catching lightning bugs, lamenting he had accidentally let his previous batch, an improvised nightlight, perish. We taped our flashlights to our mountain bikes and raced into the thin gap between the last glimmer of sunset and the first gleams of starlight. Crickets provided a backup chorus to our grotesque rendition of Yankee Doodle, whose third verse involved sticking a feather up one's butt and calling it Hershey's chocolate. We raced past houses devoid of activity and made for the dirt path to the underdeveloped lot at the edge of the subdivision. It was a shame to see home after home with lights on inside and no one out. Aside from some mosquitoes, it was a gorgeous evening, only a little sticky but cooling by the minute. Bullfrogs jumped into the ponds on either side of the trail as the wetlands grass tickled our bare legs. At the end of the path, just before the field plot, we skidded hard to the left to avoid the patch of poison sumac draped over the dirt trail. We ditched our bikes, and I did a cartwheel in the field as the lightning bugs fluttered up from the grass and burned like cold, silent fireworks in panorama. Dylan unceremoniously dumped the carcasses of his previous catch and proceeded to swipe the air around with each flash, hoping to snatch a bioluminescent beetle from the sky. I tripped and fell. I was face first in the remains of Dylan's mass grave. I picked one up and held it. I noted the contorted wings, faded red from its head, wilted antennae, twisted legs, and luminescent abdomen burnt out like a dead light bulb. Dylan beckoned me to join him, so I did without a second thought. I leaped up with a cup hand at each yellow flash in range, trying to scoop from flight. My success was apparent by the tickling of 6 tiny legs against my fingers and palm. I scraped the insect into the jar and capped the lid. The sun disappeared, and we were engulfed in a blaze of tiny, momentary suns. A lone streetlight a block away provided just enough light to see where the field ended and where the forest began. The rest of the light came from the chemical glitter-filled insects floating in the air. We had about 10 of them in the jar in only a few minutes. I asked my brother if it was enough. He held the jar to his eye and said it wasn't enough. He said he wished they could all light up all at the same time. I went back to catching while he watched the jar. Dylan yelled to me as I drifted away. He pointed at the jar. He told me they were all lighting up at the same time. I didn't believe him, but I waited anyway, just so I could tell him he was wrong and dumb. But he was right. To my astonishment, they did all light up at once in a brilliant flare. Then I looked around as it flared again, and again. The lightning bugs swarming about were also starting to flare at the same time as the ones in the jar. In under a minute, the cascade of synchronous flashes reached into the woods. Instead of a galaxy of stars living and dying in a momentary blaze, the field was a brilliant net of Christmas lights set to one on-off switch. I didn't know if it was the eerie shadows the flare cast in the woods, or it was the number of flashes that continued to grow. Dylan sealed up the jar all the way and put it in his backpack. I started thinking about leaving the display. While beautiful, it was beginning to make me feel very uneasy. It just wasn't natural to see this. 1, 2, 3, flash. 1, 2, 3, flash. 1, 2, flash. 1, 2, flash. They seemed to be getting faster, and the density of them in the middle of the field was growing. All of them seemed to bolt to the center of the field at once, and then they stopped flashing. I could hear Dylan whispering, counting 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and so on. Then suddenly, after 20 seconds, 20 chilling seconds, there was a brilliant sustained pulse from the field. It appeared as a word in the air. The insect spelled out an English word and beamed it at us like a neon light. It said in capital letters, "Hello." It repeated 2 more times. Dylan and I were stunned, and we held our breath and froze in place. There was no sound, no crickets, just a low flutter and hum from their wings beating all at once. We didn't know what to do. Eventually, I think I remember we said hello back. The bugs took their time composing their next word, which was tonight, followed by you, followed by will, and the final word was die. Hello. Tonight, you will die. Dylan and I took steps back towards our bikes. We could faintly see the glow of the flashlights taped to the handlebars partially buried in the grass, and we slowly moved towards them. The hum we heard turned angry like swarming wasps churning air into whipped cream. We started to run toward the bikes, and we mounted them with haste. The last thing I saw before we started pedaling like mad back up the trail was a giant yellow-green glow of a sphere of fireflies. The sphere must have been at least the size of a small house, at least 20 feet tall. With each flash, it seemed to encroach upon us. We raced back up the wetlands dirt trail to the quiet streets. We screamed when we could, but most of the time we were breathlessly pedaling, pushing our legs and bikes to their limit. Dylan rode just ahead of me, and he kept calling back to me to ask if I could see it. I couldn't see it, but I could hear something behind us. We tumbled off our bikes upon reaching our driveway. My legs and lung burned while my heart pumped barbed wire through my veins and muscles. I could hear the noise, but the streets, illuminated by the orange streetlights, did not reveal any house-sized orb of homicidal lightning bugs. Suddenly the neighbor's porch light, set on a timer, switched on, revealing the black, twisting, bulging, spherical mass of insects. We took 2 more seconds, and in that time the orb flattened into a disc with a circle facing us. The mass remained entirely dark as it turned towards us, and 3 orifices opened as it revealed by the porch light streaming through the holes. 2 bright yellow eyes and a crooked slit of a smile. It flashed twice, and I peed myself. And from this manifestation of the bugs, I would, later in life, developing a crippling fear of Pac-Man. We rushed into the house and locked the door. We set down our backpacks and went to wake up Robbie. Robbie was still practically comatose, so I left the hard work to Dylan while I went around the house. I picked up the receiver on the old touch-tone phone and felt an electric shock run down my hand. I yelped and dropped the phone. The cord was glowing, like the glow of the lightning bugs, pulsing gently on and off. I tried to pick it up again and the shock came again, but this time it was much more painful as I jerked and twitched for a moment or two afterwards. Quick on my feet and with my mind, I grabbed the oven mitts from the counter and put them on, and this time I picked up the phone with success and held it as close to my ear as possible without touching it to it. I was at the same time looking for something to poke the buttons, but I could only hear electrical buzzing through the earpiece and no dial tone. Robbie came waddling into the kitchen with Dylan. Robbie was mumbling something about us being grounded as he wiped his groggy, bloodshot eyes clean of goobers and crumbs. We heard something from upstairs, when it occurred to me that most of the windows were open in that part of the house. A black and yellow pulsing torrent poured in from the staircase opening. Dylan and I ducked to the floor as the thick buzzing cloud remained at Robbie's head's height. In seconds, the cloud of intruders engulfed Robbie's head. Robbie swatted and screamed in vain. From the ground, even in the midst of my skittering for cover, grasping for a sliver of my sense with which to form a plan, any course of action, I saw something I'll never forget. It was the sight of Robbie's throat, bulging like a bullfrog, with hundreds of insects clogging his airways and choking him from the inside out, and then covering him like a tarp as he collapsed to the floor, sputtering in convulsions. Dylan grabbed my hand and pulled me, as it appeared most of the intruders were preoccupied with Robbie. We shut the doors to the living room, hoping to trap them inside. We jumped as the windows near the front door and the peephole glowed in a slow, deliberate pulse at the pace of a breathlessly seething man. Cody howled and joined us as we scrambled to shut the windows on the first floor. He tirelessly barked and snarled at the living room door as streams of black began to crawl out from the small gaps between the floor and the door. The numbers were small enough, so I grabbed the blanket from the couch and shoved it under the door, stemming the army's advance. I turned around and Dylan was gone. I called out to him, then something dropped from the staircase. I yelped and turned to find him getting up from his jump. He told me he finished shutting all the windows upstairs. For the moment, it appeared that the situation was contained, although it may have killed Robbie. I didn't know then. I just knew that having bugs shoved down my throat and presumably up my nose, into my ears, and maybe crawling all the way into my brain was bad. The pulsing light, now stretching to every first-floor window, told me that we were effectively trapped inside the house. I went for the kitchen cabinet where I found a can of pesticide that was to be about a third full. I think I swore for the first time in my life as I shook it up. Cody took to snapping at the isolated fireflies attempting to escape back into the main swarm. Dylan grabbed a fly swatter and I continued to shake up the can. The small detachment of bugs met up with the main swarm at the window. They flashed back and forth as 3 of us advanced with our weapons. The detachment broke formation like a flight of blue angels and regrouped on the toy dinosaur and the RC car. Cody charged while barking. The small swarm on the T-Rex and the RC car pulsed rapidly, and then pulsed a shade of soft blue. The lightning bugs broke off and fluttered towards the ceiling, but the toys themselves continued to glow blue, and seemed to come to life despite running out of batteries hours ago. The dinosaur toy engaged Cody with a full clenching bite, the same bite industry regulators would eventually cite as a danger to fingers and toes, necessitating its eventual removal from the marketplace. The bite drew blood, which splattered on the floor as Cody fled yelping in full retreat, with the T-Rex still gnawing on his flesh between his front leg and body. In the process of trying to shake off the toy, he threw himself into the living room door, damaging the area around the doorknob. The RC car, also glowing, was idling until it accelerated directly into the door, smashing it open and releasing the swarm that had attacked Robbie. Dylan and I screamed and made a full charge for our second floor bedroom. I slammed the door shut as Dylan immediately started to pull the sheets from our bed and stuff them under the door. We had some super glue from model making, which we liberally squirted between the door frame and the door itself. The outline of the door pulsed at that same angry rate as the downstairs door did. A loud hum came from the window as the insects pressed themselves to the glass and reformed that same hideous, haunting, smiley face. I think it was then when I started to lie to Dylan, when I started to tell him everything was going to be okay. We spent at least 2 hours trapped and surrounded in abject terror as the glow flashed in from the door and the window. The eyes of the window entity seemed to follow us as we darted aimlessly about the room, seeking some sort of weapon or other means of protection. I still had the can of Raid, but I felt like anything short of a fire hose of it would not do me any good. The smile winked at us, and then floated up and away from the window. For the first time, we could see the moon in the sky. Dylan and I frantically argued if we should try to make a break for it, down a sheet rope and out into the neighbors to call the police, or if we should crack the window a bit and use our hidden firework cache to launch bottle rockets and drop M80s in the hope that somebody would call the cops on us and they would come. We didn't have long to discuss, and suddenly the hum of insects became unbearably loud from just above us. They were in the attic. We heard metallic tapping. They were in the vents above our very heads. The circular vent in the ceiling started glowing green. I grabbed the remaining sheet and Dylan and I threw us into the small but vent-free closet. Dylan held the door shut as I shoved the sheet around the gaps. We panted and yelled while the door shook as the insects repeatedly charged it. We held each other and cried, even as we sweated and felt lightheaded in the small and excruciatingly hot closet. We fell asleep in there. Well, or more correctly, we passed out. The morning came, and we could hear it because of the birds singing instead of the insects' hum. The warm yellow of the sun replaced the cold greenish yellow of the lightning bug flash. Dylan's voice was hoarse from yelling and dehydration. He asked me if I thought it was safe to go out. It stood to reason, at least at that time to me, that as powerful as they apparently were, they were still bound by their nocturnal nature, and that they had to retreat from their siege upon sunrise. I knew neither of us could last much longer in that closet without water and fresh air. I was already super weak from the heat. I made the call, and I untucked the sheet from the door. Nothing came swarming after us through the crevice. Nothing came swarming into my esophagus. So I turned the knob, and we literally fell out of our closet into our room. Aside from the sheet tucked vainly under the door to the rest of the house, nothing was amiss. We crept through the second floor of the house, investigating each room before peering over the banister to the first floor. With that, Cody came whimpering out and turned his head up at us, and then slowly approached us. He was definitely hurt, but the deep red on his chest suggested his wound stopped bleeding, and that he was safe, at least, from bleeding out. I remember that Robbie was still potentially in the house and potentially alive. I rushed downstairs and hopped through the broken living room door to find Robbie still on the kitchen floor. I approached with caution and shock. I had never seen a dead body before, and I still haven't, because then he moved. He moved in the very slightest of ways. His chest barely twitched, and the slightest of whistle came through his big nose. He at least was technically alive. I seized the phone, and when no electric shock came, I dialed 911 and reported that Robbie was unconscious. There was no CPR or anything like that back then, so I just watched him barely breathe. I jumped as a solitary lightning bug crawled out of his nose and buzzed away. I found the backpack with the jar of captured lightning bugs torn apart by the T-Rex toy. The jar was smashed open, apparently by the RC car repeatedly banging against it and a wall. Apparently they had succeeded in rescuing their captured comrades. The T-Rex and the RC car were practically destroyed. I think I ended up throwing them away anyway because they reminded Dylan and I of of the incident too much. The ambulance arrived minutes before Mom and Dad came home. They were badly hungover. I could tell because Dad actually listened to my entire story while he was icing his head and neck and pacing back and forth between the broken down interior door. He was in that stage of not being mad, just disappointed. When I say disappointed, I mean he was disappointed in Robbie despite the fact he wasn't well. He didn't really ever talk about what I told him had happened again. He didn't believe me. He just thought that Robbie had gotten us high and then passed out and we had some sort of reaction to his drugs. We all just avoided the subject. I think Dad didn't want to talk about it because he didn't want to feel irresponsible for leaving Robbie in charge of us. Speaking of Robbie was oxygen deprived for a considerable amount of time, but he ultimately survived and mostly recovered. The rumor is that he had suffered significant brain damage from the incident. Though I honestly couldn't tell, and I don't think anyone else could either. I spent the rest of my life dreading summers. I blocked out all of my windows, and so did Dylan. We never spent a summer night outside. We panicked when we saw lightning bugs, even in groups of 2s and 3s, for years later. As I mentioned before, we had another fit as grown-ass teenagers when Pac-Man came out, much to the detriment of our high school years and early dating lives. Like I said, I hadn't thought about any of this for years, mostly because nothing like it ever happened again. I never even heard a story about this happening to anybody else. Finally, I did everything I could to make sure that it would never happen again, up to and including my suburb to take extreme pest control measures. But now, my son has a jar of lightning bugs next to me. I took a hard turn, skidded out a bit, and bashed some municipal garbage cans and probably screwed up the side of my brand new hybrid car. I was heading straight into their territory, with hopes it wasn't too late to prevent my son and myself from experiencing the same fate as I did as a child. I swallowed hard before asking Jeremy if any of them had died since he captured them. He closely examined the jar, and I kept on getting distracted by watching him count. Eventually, he said no, and I felt the slightest sense of relief from that. We crossed into the other town, and they were there waiting for us. 2 swarms of fireflies lined the road like landing lights at a runway. They seemed to glide me towards the park, even knowing the way when Jeremy seemed to forget the route. I held my breath as my hybrid seemed to accelerate without the command of my foot. They had total control of my car now. We arrived at the park, and I was shaking. It reminded me far too much of my childhood, except for the fact the field leading into the small forest was marked with soccer goals and tubular playground equipment. Nevertheless, the flashes were there. My brain quaked with pain and blinding fears as I poured sweat. My son had this look of bewilderment, but also of understanding as he unscrewed the lid of the jar and shook out the 10 fireflies contained within. All 10 lit up in unison. The ones in the park slowly joined their rhythm. I clutched my son hard. I think I did it to protect him, to reassure him. When he complained I was hurting him, I knew that I was clutching him for me. They swirled around the center of the park before saying, "Hello?" Jeremy's mouth dropped, and he picked up the smartphone and started recording. "Hello. Tonight. Hello. Tonight. You will live." Then they didn't flash again. Jeremy told me that his phone was recording, but he couldn't play back the footage. I still didn't want to tell him the story. It's late. I've been up all night since returning the fireflies to the park with my son. My wife wants me to come to bed, but I'm trying to find closure in all this by writing this down now. Anyways, maybe it's all in vain anyways. I really can't sleep in there right now. There's a firefly trapped between the screen and the window, and I'm too afraid to get it out.